Alright, so the last great decade. 1990s was a simpler time. Grunge rock, slapstick comedies, and no one was worried about being politically correct. In case you haven't figured it out for yourself by my exorbitant PowerPoint here, over the next few minutes I'm going to be explaining why the 1990s was a better decade than the 2010s and even the early 2020s a little bit, based on movies, sports, and politics. So as a 16-year-old that grew up way after the 90s, one thing I have been able to experience from that time period is the movies. And some great movies came out in the 90s like Jurassic Park, Forrest Gump, Dumb and Dumber. I have a bunch more listed up there. More than sit here and talk about how great I think 90s movies are, the biggest point I want to get across is how movies today have dropped off. Chris Gore, the director of some of those early 2000 Star Wars films, put it about as bluntly as possible in an interview last year, saying, quote, "I would say that 99% of most movies today are pretty bad." Doesn't get more clear than that. He would go on to explain that bold statement a little bit more in the interview, saying that directors today just take a template of what they've seen work before and milk it for as much money as possible. And what comes out of that is very predictable and just not very fun to watch. Now, in the 90s, just about everything was original. So just based purely on that originality, movies were much more fun and interesting to watch, and it just created a better cinematic experience. Staying on the topic of entertainment, sports, and specifically the NBA was at its peak during the 90s. The games were more physical, players cared more about every game. According to Bleacher Report, the star players of the league played on average 5 more minutes per game and played more games per season during the 90s. And this was just due to the fact that there was a higher level of competitiveness, the rivalries were better, and players just had overall a higher commitment to their team. Another thing that was better about 90s basketball and really just sports in general is that they kept politics out of the sports. They allowed it to be what it's supposed to be, which is an escape from reality. Unfortunately, we don't have that luxury today. Sports organizations, they're picking sides. You can look at just about anyone and figure out what their political view is. And I think the fact that organizations are picking political sides is a big reason for my next point here. That's that there was a lot less political division during the 90s. You could talk to someone with opposing political view and still know where they're coming from. Of course, that's not me. That's just me talking to my parents and stuff. But to give a more specific example that I can actually put down on paper, Bill Clinton was the president for the majority of the 90s. He served from 93 to 2001. He's a Democrat, but according to newsgallup.com, he had about a 40% approval rate among Republicans. That really put that number in perspective. Joe Biden, our current Democratic president, has less than a 10% approval rate among Republicans. There was just less division. People were more willing to see the other side during the 90s, and I would assume that would make it a better time to live. Now, someone that's advocating for the 2010s, early 2020s being a better decade, they're almost definitely going to bring up the technological advancements and how technology today is so much better than it was in the 90s. And I have no argument for that. That's a fact. The technology today is way better than it was in the 90s. But that being said, technology has become so advanced that it's taking over our lives. A study by Reader's Health found that teens spend an average of 3 hours a day playing video games. And a separate study found that they spend about 5 to 5.5 hours a day on their phones. So really put those numbers in perspective for a second. 8, 9 hours on electronics. 7 hours of sleep, if they're getting a healthy amount of sleep because they're spending so much time on their phones and other electronics. 8 hours at school. That's a full day right there. That's 24 hours. So that means because of the technology, there's no time for extracurricular activities, spending time with your family, spending time with your friends outside of school. That kind of is disappearing from our society today because technology is taking over our lives so much. So to that argument of the technology today is so much better than it was in the 90s, I have to ask the question, is that a good thing? Is that really a good thing for us and for our society? It's just something to think about. So to briefly conclude, I believe that the 1990s was a better decade than the 2020s, or than the 2010s and early 2020s, based on the originality of movies, the lack of division in politics, and the fact that I think we were better off with the less advanced technology. If nothing I've said today has done anything to persuade you, the 90s brought us this picture with the rock and a fanny pack, and that's an argument in itself. Thank you.